There was a period in the history of this planet where planet Earth had no life that we can find any trace of, certainly no fossils, but no even chemical traces of life. So if living things were, say, in the water or soil when certain rock strata were formed, there would be some sort of a chemical trace. The chemicals of living things are different from those of non-living things. And we don't have that. And so there was a period reaching almost 3.8 or 3.5 billion years ago, where there was no life on Earth. So this would be, say, 800 million years, maybe a billion years of Earth's early history when Earth was essentially a dead planet. When life is first found, it is found in the ocean, not on land. And so life is known in the ocean from the early Archaean. Life on land is only known in the past, say, 500 million years in the Phanerozoic eon. And so if we're going to talk about life on Earth, we're going to talk about life in the ocean for almost 3 billion years before it is known on land. And although we focus a lot today on birds and mammals and fish and insects and plants, etc., all the animals that I just named, they are once again known only in this Phanerozoic eon. And so Earth's history is quite a long stretch, and a lot of the life which is most obvious to us today is only known from the most recent part. So for example, all vertebrates, all land plants, known from the past 500 million years or so, while our planet is 4.6 billion years old. And so if there was no life on Earth, and then there was this time period when there was life on Earth, but not vertebrates or plants, which would be known here, or not even animals, which there would be invertebrate animals known in this yellow section. What was alive here? Well, while there would be eukaryotic algae and amoebas and other things in this green section, which can be the topic of the next video, this red portion here is a third of the history of life on Earth. 1.5 billion years. And for a third of the history of life on Earth, once again, 1.5 billion years, there was only one type of living thing, the prokaryotes. So there are no eukaryotic yeast or amoebas or eukaryotic algae. There are no animals or plants. There are only prokaryotes. And so for a third of the history of life, prokaryotes had the Earth to themselves, which then begs the question, what is a prokaryote? So here you can see a typical animal cell, a typical plant cell, and then here you can see a prokaryotic cell. These are the bacteria of today. So bacteria are prokaryotes. And one can see that on average, there are major differences between the cell types. Plants and animals being eukaryotic cells, their cells are larger. They have a membrane-bound nucleus so that the DNA is not floating anywhere in the cell, but rather is in a nucleus which has a double membrane. There are other membrane-bound organelles like mitochondria, endoplasmic reticulum. In the plant cell, there are chloroplasts. And so there are things that the eukaryotic cells share, mitochondria, Golgi in the nucleus, etc., that prokaryotes don't have, which are typically smaller and then simpler, lacking these membrane-bound organelles, which you see here. So prokaryotic cells seem then to be the simplest form of life on Earth, but then also the first form of life on Earth. So it was 3.8 billion years ago that there are the first traces of life on Earth. The first bacteria, 3.5 billion years ago. And it is not until the next eon that the first eukaryotic cells occur in the Proterozoa. So if one were to consider cells, there are fossils which might represent protocells, or they might just represent complex bubbles which exist in Greenland. But from 3.5 billion years ago, there are fossils of living things, but they are fossils of prokaryotic cells. So each of these dots is alive, magnified 400 times, or magnified here, say 1,000 times. So that is alive, that is alive. Each of these is alive. But you can see that these are very simple. Even magnified 1,000 times, they are quite small, and they lack, things like the nucleus, the membrane-bound organelles, which make so many other cells distinctive. Now, if you were to look at other cells, like these cells lining the human intestine, magnified 400 times, or this cell of human blood magnified 1,000 times, or this bone marrow cell, look at how big this is. All right, notice that there's a nucleus. Notice, the internal complexity. And the size is enormous. Not only is that big here, but this nerve cell can have processes which stretch in feet. So there is a difference between this type of cell, which makes up the human body, the human nerve cell, this human bone marrow cell, this human blood cell, these human intestinal cells. These are eukaryotic cells, being larger and having membrane-bound structures inside the cell, such as the nucleus and other organelles. But eukaryotic cells are only known for half of the history, or half of Earth's history, starting, say, 2 billion years ago. But life starts 3.5 billion years ago. So for 1.5 billion years, there are no cells that look like this, but there are cells. And the cells which originate, the earliest cells in Earth's history, are the prokaryotic cells, which look like this. Now, prokaryotic cells, or bacteria, they can move. And so many have flagella. So here you see bacterial cells. Now, bacteria are the most abundant organisms on Earth. So for example, large intestines, that's the large intestine of this ruminant, are full of bacteria, trillions of them. So for example, when I look in the mirror, I'm not only seeing human cells, but there's bacteria in this stuff. There are bacteria that live on us. There are bacteria which live in us. Maybe about 2 pounds of bacteria. There are actually more bacterial cells associated with the human body than there are human body cells. And bacteria are everywhere. They are in ice. They are in soil. They are in sediment deep under the ocean. In fact, because bacteria have been found, in rock, I mean, just doing, metabolizing very slowly, but nevertheless, in porous rocks underneath the ocean floor, it is possible. Now, what I'm about to say is really odd, but when we think of life on Earth, we think of what we can see on the surface. There are plants, there are, fish in the ocean, etc. But underneath this rock, bacteria have been found as far down as we have dug. It is possible that the majority of life on Earth is not even this surface stuff that we are familiar with, but rather with all of the, all of the bacteria which can live, in the subsurface, because, if they can go down very deep, the volume of them, even if they're metabolizing very slowly and reproducing very slowly, nevertheless, it could take they could make up the majority of life on Earth. So prokaryotes are the most abundant living things in the world. And we split prokaryotic cells into 2 groups. Now, these groups are so fundamental that we call them actually different kingdoms. So it should be then stressed that not all bacteria are the same. Some are so distinct from each other that we actually classify them in a completely different kingdom known as Archaea. So there are the Archaea and the Eukaryotes. The Eukaryotes are true bacteria. That's kind of what we think of usually when we think of bacteria. Archaea were originally described as living in very harsh environments, so that there can be the pools near volcanic activity, or the seafloor at extreme pressures and temperatures, etc. So Archaea were originally associated with living in very extreme environments. But it's now known that they're more diverse than that. You can find them in freshwater and marine water. You can find them in our intestines, whether they be humans or ruminants. And the way that we know this is the only living things which produce methane as a waste, the only living things which are methanogens, are archaea, prokaryotic cells. And so the fact that intestines are breaking down food and producing methane as a waste mean that there are archaea there. And so there are diverse types of bacteria, so diverse that we put them in different kingdoms. And I have other videos that go into the differences in bacterial cell walls or flagella that separate the archaea from eubacteria. So there are certainly a lot of interesting features which differ, but it seems that archaea are quite old. And the way that you know this is because the chemicals of archaea are different from the chemicals of eubacteria. And therefore, one could analyze rocks. And even if you don't find fossils, you could look for chemicals which only are known in bacteria known as archaea. And so, therefore, there are examples of these which go back billions of years. So, archaea are certainly not a new group. And methane preserved in rocks might also, which then goes back even further, might be suggestive that archaea date back from this period, given that all modern methanogens are archaea. So there are two groups of bacteria, and the archaea seem to have been a very early branch, and maybe going back to around the time that we're first finding fossils of living things in general, there may have been two groups of living things at about that time. All right, so archaea, many live in very extreme environments, and the most basal branches of bacteria are also found in very extreme environments like great temperatures and pressures. So not only are there thermophiles, bacteria which like hot temperatures, there are also hyperthermophiles, bacteria which thrive in very high temperatures, which is significant because we think the early Earth was hotter than it is now, and the environments were more extreme. And the fact that there's this branch in the family tree of life, and that archaea, many of them prefer extreme environments, and the most basal branches of eubacteria, they prefer extreme environments, maybe remnants of life having evolved in a planet which is more extreme than it is now. Now, I'd like to focus on one more group of bacteria which had significance in the history of life on Earth. But before I do, when we study modern bacteria, just certainly things are just amazing. Much of this is beyond us, but I just wanted to introduce a couple of thoughts and then get to the last big concept or two. First of all, there's just an amazing number of bacteria in the world. So if you were to just take a milliliter of a sample, including from things like hot springs and extreme environments, you can find millions and millions of living things. So a milliliter, all right, can have just incredible amounts of life. And so when you multiply that by an entire planet and estimate like how many bacteria might there be on our planet, it's just an incredible number. They are truly the most numerous living things on Earth. In fact, they outnumber human cells in the human body. So the human body has more bacterial cells associated with it than it has human cells. And they vary. Once again, this is beyond us. It would be more, a study of the microbes of today. But just, I'd hate for you to think of fossil microbes as all these, small round balls, for 1.5 billion years. Bacteria come in many shapes. So they can be round, rod-shaped, spiral. They can be spirochetes. They can have then additional odd shape from square to elongated rods, comma-shaped, etc. They can vary enormously in size. Like a micron is about a typical size for a microbe, but there are some which are much larger than that, and actually two which could actually be seen without a microscope. They are so big. And so, you know, I just want to introduce bacteria in general, but eukaryotic cells are coming as the next topic. And so one could ask the question, well, how could these little simple bacteria evolve into the big complex eukaryotes? And while that's a good question, part of the answer would just be this richer understanding of both bacteria and eukaryotes. So it's not as if all prokaryotes are tiny and all eukaryotes are huge. There are small eukaryotes which are smaller than big prokaryotes. And so if you were to ask, how does a little, prokaryote evolve into a big eukaryote? Once again, if some prokaryotes are bigger than eukaryotes, that's not quite the leap that one thought. If one were to compare the size between the smallest bacteria and the largest bacteria, so if here's a tiny bacteria here, which is a fraction of a micron, look at those little yellow dots compared to these larger ones, all right? Or then even the largest ones. So once again, there's this huge diversity in bacteria. If you were to, try to argue that, bacteria are very simple genetically, that's certainly the case. But bacteria, some have multiple chromosomes. Some are rod shaped, some are round like ours. Some bacteria can have a folded membrane. So while they don't have membrane-bound organelles, their cell membrane is folded so that it's almost the same thing. If you ask, how could a nucleus evolve, a membrane around the DNA? Some bacteria actually have a membrane around their DNA. We don't call it a nucleus. We don't think it's a double membrane, but nevertheless, it's close. Bacteria, can live in these very extreme environments, as I said, at high pressures, very high salt concentrations, without oxygen. At very high temperatures, etc. And they have various lifestyles where some do photosynthesis for energy. Some use photosynthesis to get carbon. Others depend on other living things for energy and carbon. So they can be decomposers, they can be parasites. Many are actually predators. There are bacterial predators which are capable of feeding on other bacteria, even even eukaryotic cells. So some bacterial cells are hunters feeding on, say, eukaryotic algae. And I just say that because, many people will have, bacteria, these small, simple, round things, and for 1.5 billion years, that's all there were. But bacteria are so much more diverse and complex, potentially, than a lot of people give them credit for. So for 1/3 of the history of life on Earth, a diversity of bacteria existed. Now, I had said that one of the things that bacteria can have as a lifestyle is that they can perform photosynthesis. And it should then be stressed that there are different kinds of photosynthesis that bacteria can perform. So something like, say, rhodospirillum, it can perform photosynthesis, but it doesn't produce oxygen as a waste, and it doesn't have green chlorophyll, but rather other pigments which make it look purple. And so here we have two photosynthetic bacteria, but they are unrelated to each other. So there are very different kinds of photosynthesis in bacteria. Now, this then gets us back to one last group of bacteria, which I can't overstate the importance that this had in the fossil record. So blue-green algae are not algae, they're bacteria, and more properly called cyanobacteria. And it's not that there's a couple, they form a phylum. So when you think of the vertebrates, arthropods form a phylum, mollusks form a phylum, chordates form a phylum that includes the vertebrates. In bacteria, cyanobacteria are a phylum. So it's a really big, diverse group, okay? Now, they are significant in the fossil record because we could literally take the history of our planet and split it into two big halves. One half is the half in which there was no appreciable oxygen in the atmosphere. We know this because metals didn't oxidize, irons didn't rust to any appreciable degree, which it would have if there was oxygen present. We know that oxygen wasn't present because the chemical compounds which would form when oxygen is present is different from when it's not present. So for about half of the Earth's history, there was no appreciable oxygen in the atmosphere. But then for the other half of Earth's history, there was appreciable oxygen in the atmosphere. And so if the planet Earth went from having essentially no oxygen in the atmosphere to oxygen in the atmosphere, and it went up over time, it didn't like magically appear at modern levels, so it gradually increased. Then what happens here? What happened here to turn our planet from one without oxygen appreciable in the atmosphere to one where there was? And the answer is simple. This is when a new group of bacteria makes its first debut in the fossil record. So cyanobacteria are evident in the fossil record shortly before 2 billion years ago. So maybe like 2.4 billion years ago. And while there are different kinds of photosynthesis in bacteria, the kind that the cyanobacteria perform is significant because they can take carbon dioxide and water, and then using the energy from sunlight, convert that into energy-rich molecules such as glucose. So this is significant for two reasons. One, living things need energy. And so the energy from sunlight is being stored in the chemical bonds here. So this photosynthesis is storing energy. But secondly, living things need carbon molecules. Now, carbon molecules are all around us, like carbon dioxide and methane. But that's not the type of molecule that living things need. Living things need things like sugar and amino acids. And most organisms, like me, I can't take carbon dioxide and turn it into sugar. So this is coming in every breath that I take, but I cannot take those black dots and put them into the black dots of sugars or proteins or fats, etc. All right, I have to eat food and get my organic molecules, black dots in sugars and fatty acids and amino acids from other living things. So me as an animal, I cannot convert carbon dioxide from the non-living world into carbon in biomolecules. But cyanobacteria can, not all photosynthetic bacteria can. And so they can use sunlight to get two things, energy and also carbon in organic molecules. And then this changed our planet. First of all, because now they're important for food chains, because lots of things can now eat cyanobacteria, and now they get carbon from the cyanobacteria that they ingest. And so things like amoebas and paramecia can get carbon in them by ingesting that from cyanobacteria. So here are images of cyanobacteria. They are bacteria, even though we call them blue-green algae. They perform photosynthesis. They release oxygen into the atmosphere. I'll get back to the sponge. And just as a group of bacteria, they're incredibly important. Many of them can fix nitrogen, which means they can take nitrogen gas and turn it into ammonia and nitrates. That's something that, once again, most living things can't do. And so if you need nitrogen, you could eat cyanobacteria and get your nitrogen. So here we see some cyanobacteria. It's kind of cute that these actually move a little bit. They can bend. So blue-green algae have not always existed. They're not in the fossil record. Plus, if they had been, there would have been oxygen in the atmosphere going back to the beginning. But shortly after they appear in the fossil record for the first time, oxygen levels began to rise because they put it there. The photosynthesis that they perform releases oxygen gas as a waste. So they transformed planet Earth from one without much oxygen to a planet which then had oxygen. And so cyanobacteria, once again, are fundamentally changed the planet in a way that then benefits so many other living things, because the more complex eukaryotic cells, with very few exceptions, they rely on oxygen. They evolved after cyanobacteria. So after cyanobacteria, put oxygen in the atmosphere, then there is a new type of cell which depends on oxygen. The animals which depend on oxygen occur much later. So cyanobacteria changed our planet. Now, the way I've just described it, they changed it for the better. So the oxygen that they put in the atmosphere, all right, are things that eukaryotic cells will need, that animals will ultimately need. So, yay for cyanobacteria. However, oxygen kills if you don't know how to deal with the reactive forms of it. So the oxygen that they added to the atmosphere, when it transformed the planet, it probably caused lots of bacterial death. There are lots of bacteria today, even some living in your intestines, which die in the presence of oxygen. They need to live in the absence of oxygen in anaerobic environments. So adding oxygen to the air wasn't, this win-win. It actually killed a lot of the previous life on Earth. Also, it would have changed the temperature of our planet, because now that there's oxygen, it reacts. And now you'd have, say, less methane in the air and more carbon dioxide, because the carbon of methane reacts with oxygen to form carbon dioxide. But that would have affected the temperature of our planet, because methane traps more heat than carbon dioxide. So they're putting oxygen in the air probably cooled the planet down. And as I'll describe in the next video, late in the Proterozoic, there are ice ages, the worst our planet has ever known. We even think at certain points the oceans froze, or at least largely froze. And so the blue-green algae putting oxygen in the air would have had negative consequences for much of the life at the time, and would have contributed to the, quote, snowball Earth glacial conditions of the late Proterozoic, right? So cyanobacteria, the blue-green algae, it's a kind of bacteria, but one of the most fundamental forms of life on Earth. They dramatically changed our planet. And the life that evolves afterwards evolves in the world that they helped create with their oxygen. So we can't overstate their significance. And then also, not only I'm sorry, before I do that. They're just fascinating. So they're big compared for bacteria. They live in chains or colonies. Most bacteria don't. So that's significant. And then even they can have some specialized cells, like, one cell out of the colony can say, hey, I'll be the one that fixes the nitrogen and makes it available. Once again, that's very unusual for bacteria. In our bodies, cells specialize. You have a nerve cell over here, a muscle cell over here. But the fact that some of them specialize is important. All right, so they can form a variety of specialized structures. Here you see one in this chain. You can see some in those chains there. Now, just one other thing: cyanobacteria are food. All right, and so for example, sponges can ingest cyanobacteria and get their energy and their carbon molecules. But some living things can actually have cyanobacteria living inside them. All right, and so there could be like teamwork, and we can get to this later, where cyanobacteria perform photosynthesis and the other organism gives it a home. So for example, cyanobacteria can participate in lichens, where the fungus is providing support and structure. The cyanobacteria is providing sugar, and it's teamwork. Even though there are some sponges which get energy from the sun, performing photosynthesis, not because their animal cells can, but because they have cyanobacteria associated with them that do. Even though cyanobacteria aren't the primary photosynthesis organisms in corals, they can also contribute there. Now, you may be unimpressed with cyanobacteria. So they're green, so they have chlorophyll. So they perform photosynthesis, where they make sugar and release oxygen as a gas. Don't green algae, don't plants do the same thing? Yes, they do. Because if this is a cyanobacteria, all right, this little green blob, and you look inside a green alga or even a plant cell, the plant cell isn't green. The green alga cell isn't green. It has these little green membrane-bound structures, which we call chloroplasts, which are the size of cyanobacteria, which have the shape of cyanobacteria, which have traits which I'm going to mention in the next video. So the reason that green algae are green and that plants are green, and the reason that they can perform photosynthesis, is because the descendants of cyanobacteria live inside these cells. So inside a plant cell are chloroplasts, which are descended from cyanobacteria, which learn to live in larger cells. So once again, cyanobacteria, we can get back to that, one of the most important forms of life on Earth. And they made such a big impact on Earth that if you look at rocks shortly after they evolved, you find the majority of Earth's banded iron formations when iron stopped being dissolved in ocean water and now instead oxidized with oxygen and then settled out and formed these great deposits of iron oxide. They're called red beds because you can see that oxidized iron has more of a red color. This occurred after the cyanobacteria were adding oxygen to the atmosphere. So once again, this form of bacteria had this incredible impact on life on Earth. The last point is that being a biologist, I like studying, I like studying all forms of life. So bacteria are interesting, period. But there's another reason to study bacteria, even if you're more interested in yourself. Say, I don't really care about bacteria. I'm interested in humans. Well, because life on Earth was just bacteria for a third of its history, all right? A third of the history of life on Earth, there were no animals, there were no eukaryotes, there was just bacteria. And so when we think of the things that the more complex organisms had, it's things that the bacteria developed that these other things then built on. And so there are things that all living things share, like the use of DNA, which encodes for RNA, which encodes for protein, a genetic code, all right, where UUU is a codon, which means a specific amino acid. AU, so phenylalanine. AUG is a specific codon, which means methionine. A phospholipid membrane with cholesterol. But even then, genes. So even though I use hemoglobin in my blood, complicated blood cells. Bacteria use globins. They were the ones who invented globins. Animals would just modify globins for other uses. Even though I use serine proteases to digest my food, they're enzymes which can break up proteins. It was the bacteria which invented the serine proteases. And so many of the molecules which are important, like the G protein coupled receptors, which can detect light as an opsin, they were invented by bacteria. Bacteria use G protein coupled receptors as opsins to detect light. The way that I break down my food in my mitochondria to get energy, it's called the Krebs cycle and the electron transport system. This was invented by bacteria. So in the 1.5 billion years that the only living things were bacteria, significant things were happening there. Life was evolving new molecules, new genetic mechanisms of how to, produce things, on how to make a cytoskeleton, on how to fix mutations, etc. So this red period here, that's a third of the history of life on Earth. It's not irrelevant to the humans which come up here, or the animals which are in here, because many of the things that allows animals and humans to be complex were things which evolved during this time period among the prokaryotes. So they laid the foundation for many of the more complex living things later. All right, and so we'll skip this, but if you think of this video has tried to summarize a third of the history of life on Earth. Obviously, we'll slow down when we talk about dinosaurs and fish, etc. They're bigger and easier to study, but certainly the prokaryotes and the first prokaryotes are significant.